It's been interesting today to see the different ways that people have approached it. And I think for those of you who are students, they watch through the day and different people have approached it quite differently. There's been a mix of history, a little bit of theory in William's presentation. So I think that's been interesting to watch. And I think it's been really interesting in the last session to see a bit of robust debate emerging, and not just between the speakers, but to see some of you students buying into the issue. That's been really gratifying, and I know as one of the speakers, I'd just love to see more of that robust engagement developing as the day goes on. My presentation today is going to have a bit of history and probably rather more theory than some of the other presentations today. Now that's partly because the brief for me was to give a sense of what small open economy modelling is in Australia in the post-war period has been all about. And I think it's hard to do that without actually having a bit of a look at a very simple model. I think it's helpful for students too to see something of the mechanics of this model. I defend it too because if you have listened to Peter, to listen to Max later on, David I don't think is speaking today, but in all those cases are eminent trade economists. It might give you a very informal presentation, but lying behind all of their work, Peter gave a historical presentation today that has made distinguished contributions to trade theory. And Max will give, I'm sure, we were talking last night, there's not going to be a lot of analytics in his presentation this afternoon, but Max made enormous contributions as a trade theorist, particularly early on in his career. And some of the institutional policy work that he and others did, I think was only possible because of that analytical basis, which gives you an ability to cut through the mess of institutions and data and to focus on what's really important. So probably slightly outside the average, but quite deliberately so. I'm going to give you a little bit more modelling and a bit less of some of the other things in this presentation. Not quite there yet. Well, the first point I'd like to make in clearly think about small open economy modelling is just the enormous, one thing that strikes someone who's a historian of trade theory is just the enormous contributions that Australians have made. And I'm sure I've left some out there, and I've included a couple that stretch the definition of post-war a little bit. But as the Brigham report, which William spoke about, and Roy Wilson's work, which David alluded to in his question earlier. Now, I think you need to have those in mind to understand some of the later developments in post-war modelling in Australia. I'm sure I've left some out, but enormous contributions to international trade theory through the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s by Australians. And very strong links between the theoretical work in almost all cases. Kemp, perhaps an exception there. Perhaps Alan Woodland, but very strong links between the theory and the work people are doing and policy problems, and particularly push to liberalise Australia's trade relations. I'm going to skip over to a bit of a parenthesis now, and this again is a bit of a slide for some of the students here who might be thinking about what they're doing and talking. Before we started this morning, some people were very interested in doing historical work. One area that's very wide open is the history of trade theory. And no one has yet written a comprehensive account of the Australian contributions. That's a story to be written, and particularly connecting the Australian theoretical contributions to the policy process. But as well, we're in a strange situation, almost unique in trade as a subdiscipline in economics, where we haven't got a recent, serious, comprehensive history of the subdiscipline. Jacob Weiner's Studies in the Theory of International Trade, published in 1937, incorporating some earlier articles of his, remains unsurpassed, and particularly for the early period. Now, Weiner's Studies is problematic because it's 1937 is a long time ago. Even some people here are struggling to remember 1937. I certainly struggled very greatly to remember 1937. But it's also problematic because Weiner was a participant, and that 1937 history was very much coloured by the debates that he was engaged in with Bertil Ohlin and Prof. Hubler and others about things like real cost theory of values versus money cost, Austrian approaches versus other approaches to the theory of value. And Weiner, as a participant, is sometimes stretching the historical observer position a little bit in that book. One of the great virtues of the book, though, is that it does cross both the pure theory and the monetary financial sides of the theory, and Weiner was very, very good at that. We do have quite a few histories of international money and finance in the post-war period. Jim Flanders' book I mentioned there, but as some here have also written on these topics, I know. Some people mention Doug Irwin, who is a very, very good historian and trade theorist in the US. Doug Irwin's books, particularly Against the Tide. But Against the Tide is basically dependent on Weiner for the early development of the theory. And it's an account of the policy debate over free trade, rather than an account of the development of theory in the larger context of what was going on in economics and in the wider world. So for students, this area, the history of trade theory, is something which is really quite wide open at the moment. Probably as a student you'd be looking to do smaller studies rather than trying to write the new Weiner. Just jumping back a bit to Australia, one of the questions that I was chatting with a few others about is we've had these enormously distinguished Australian contributions to trade theory in the post-war period. But I was talking with a couple of people, and we were really struggling to get together a list of younger people in Australian universities doing trade theory at that sort of level. And that's, of course, we still have particularly senior economists who are pushing the trade liberalisation process. We still have very good economists in the public service and some of the agencies who are working on trade issues, Treasury Productivity Commission. But in universities, there's a real gap in trade theory. Australia has gone from being, if you like, a major exporter of trade theory to being a major importer of trade theory. Why might this be so? Well, a few hypotheses I came up with, and others here I'm sure will have other suggestions. And the models that Australians have worked with in most of the post-war period perhaps are less relevant to our current problems. It seems to me one of the major trade policy issues for the moment is participation in preferential trading arrangements. And that's been an issue that very few of the economists on that list that I had earlier, perhaps Peter Lloyd, perhaps Murray Kemp alone, have contributed significantly to. So perhaps there's a mismatch between the sorts of modelling that Australians have traditionally done and the current trade policy problems that we face. There's perhaps also a sense that trade policy reform is over, it's been achieved, we can move on to other things. People always comment about that, it was interesting, I think right. But there's still a lot of work to be done in agricultural trade reform and about our participation in things like this terrible Trans-Pacific Partnership. We can't do anything about the absolutely appalling US-Australia, I hesitate to say, free trade agreement, and some of the other real shockers that Australia has been involved in and might be involved in. But I'm not sure that those explanations really are adequate. And I think we could look for explanations in two things: incentives and agglomeration. And incentives for economists in Australian universities really are very heavily now publishing in a small group of international, mostly theoretical or high-level econometric journals. The questions that, I'm in a bit of an unusual situation, Australian Catholic University, business faculty, with a dean who hates economics, so, in a more normal department. Your head of economics would be asking you how many papers have you published in the last 12 months in A or A-star journals, this kind of hierarchy of journals that we economists, in fact, all people in Australian universities now deal with. And if I publish something on Australian policy issues, it's probably going to be a journal that's C-ranked or perhaps even an unpublished report. And I'm going to receive a frown from my head of department if I've done too much of that work. If I've done something that's completely incomprehensible, published in the Journal of International Economics or the International Economic Review, then you'll get a smile and return to your face. That, I think, is important. One of the other things that's important is agglomeration. I think more and more we're doing high-level work. We need to be part of a team of people who are doing it. And in trade theory, two of the most active areas at the moment I work on the good economy of trade and empirical work on trade. We've got to a point in trade theory now where we can do a serious econometric work with general good and trade models. That wasn't the case in the 50s and 60s because of data and computing constraints. And that work, that empirical work, requires very large amounts of money, computing power that are beyond an individual trade economist working in Australia. That's a couple of possibilities for why we've had this decline, this very sharp decline in Australian production of international trade theory. And I lament this because I think that so much of the reform movements that were achieved through the 50s and 60s and 70s were built on a foundation of theoretically accomplished economists who were using that understanding of how things worked and the ability to win the arguments and to quantify things properly, which is so important in the reform process, and we've lost that essentially in Australia, certainly as regards our university economists, university trade economists. I have to say I plead guilty as well because my PhD was trade, but I work on a whole lot of other things besides trade at the moment too. Now, here's the thing I sort of warned you about earlier, that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how a very simple small open economy model works. The essential element in a small open economy model is that we've got an exogenous, that means that we can't influence it, we take it as given in doing our modelling work. We've got an exogenous world price of traded goods. But typically you're making that assumption within a small-scale competitive general equilibrium model. The Australian twist in this type of small open economy modelling has been including a non-tradable commodity. And that non-tradable commodity, its price is set partly through domestic production conditions And domestic production conditions, domestic factor markets, are influenced by what's going on in the rest of the world. But it's also influenced by domestic demand. And including this non-tradable commodity gives you a far more flexible and interesting small open economy model in lots of ways. That the original move in this direction was made by Ronald Wilson and his absolutely brilliant book in the 1930s, Capital Imports in Terms of Trade. And this model was further developed by Trevor Swan, Wilfred Salter in the 1950s. Max Corden did a lot of work with this model, this type of model in the 60s. He often referred to as the blended economy model. The name, the Australian model, stuck probably in the 70s, as far as I can work out, due to Rita Dornbush. But there's a related literature on the Dutch disease, which Max contributed to Peter Neary, and there's Bob Gregory, which is snakes. Sorry, that's not 1997, it's 1977, in which Richard Snake is no longer with us. His work on the economic effects of the minerals boom, very similar to Bob Gregory's work, was in the 70s, and it's using a very quite closely related model to the one I'll be presenting. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the Australian model. It's been one of our, it's been probably the most used model by that group of very important Australian trade theorists in the post-war period. Now, what's the model about? Well, I'm going to be presenting a particular version of it. Many of the models that I mentioned on the last slide are simple variations of this, but I think this is a very flexible basis for understanding a lot of what's going on in Australian trade, and particularly links between trade and factor markets and the welfare of different groups in Australia. So the model I'm going to be presenting has two factors of production, and we'll be interpreting those factors as skilled and unskilled labour. There are three goods in our model: an exported good, an imported good, and a non-traded good. I'm going to be making a simplifying assumption, and we'll see why this assumption is made later. The good one is not consumed at home, so it's just produced, it's not consumed at home, and the imported good is not produced at home. We have to specify in any of these models factor intensity, and the good one, the exported good, use skilled labour relatively intensely. I think that's a reasonable description of what happens in Australia. Identical homothetic preferences are a technical assumption we use to simplify things. Basically, it's saying that the consumption ratios are independent of the level of the income. Something which I'm doing in this model, which is not in some of the Australian literature, is I'm going to be imposing a minimum wage which applies to all labour, but binds for unskilled labour, which is less productive than skilled labour. And imposing a minimum wage means you've got unemployment in the model. In solving the model, we need a numerator. Numerator here will be 1. And I wanted to find two things here. Firstly, the terms of trade, which tells you about the terms at which we're exchanging exported goods for imported goods. And in this Australian model with the non-traded good, there's another thing called the real exchange rate. Real exchange rate is used in lots of different ways, but here, and consistent with most of the Australian model literature, I'm going to be saying it's the price of the traded good in terms of the non-traded. So here, P2 over P3, and that means that a fall in that ratio is a real appreciation. Now, don't be frightened by this. It looks like a whole load of mess. But I wanted to show you this, even though it's ridiculous to go through this in detail. But I just wanted to give you a sense of what someone who's sitting down with a model like this and trying to derive results, trying to understand some of the linkage in the economy is actually doing. Having made your assumptions, the next step is to write down a set of equilibrium conditions and equilibrium in this production sector of the model. And the thing about the small open economy assumption that's taking world prices as given means that you can basically isolate the production sector of the economy and analyse it. So in this model, the equilibrium conditions are a set of zero profit conditions. There's a zero profit condition there for each commodity. The way the notation works here, the little superscripts tell you which commodity or factor. So the price of good 1 is equal to this thing, which is the minimised cost of production of good 1, which depends on the prices of depends on the technology and the prices of the factors of production rather than industry 1. So under competitive conditions, industries firms earn zero profits. Zero profits are earned in the export of good 1. The other equilibrium condition here, remember that the imported good is not produced domestically, so the price of non-traded good is equal to the cost of production in the non-traded good industry. We also require full employment of both factors of production. These things here, you can think of as input-output coefficients. So this is the amount of factor 1 used in good 1, and that will depend on the prices of the factors of production. Now there's a little bit of a story to be told about a thing called Shepard's lemon, which is a wonderful piece of theory which helps us to write this nicely and compactly, but just trying to give you an overall sense of what someone is doing when they're working with a model rather than trying to give you a lecture on basic trade theory. So we assume that there's full employment in a factor 1. Of course, we've got unemployment of factor 2 because there's minimum wage here. We specify relative demand. That's the ratios in which the two products are consumed depend on the relative prices of the goods. The market for non-traded goods clears, and there's a balance of trade condition for the traded good. So you make your assumptions, you write down the equilibrium conditions, and then you can solve the model. So what you do with this model is you can solve those equilibrium conditions to determine the endogenous variables, the things we're getting out of the model. So that's the price of factor 1, the price of factor 2, of course, is fixed by the minimum wage. The outputs of the two commodities, the price of the non-traded goods, and the consumptions of the two goods. And those endogenous variables can be written as functions of the things we're assuming, exogenous variables. And that's the endowments of the factors, the world price of the imported good. Remember that we're holding the price of the exported good 1 constant. So this model is set up so that it can be very, very easily solved. There's various sort of tricks and bits and pieces to making something like this easily solvable and tractable. After you've solved the model, I'll comment on this. This is one thing this, by the way, is based on a model which I've previously used in a paper published in Australian Economic Papers some years ago. And one of that was a paper about trying to write down a general version of the Australian model as a properly specified general equilibrium model. And one of the things which I tried to do, which wasn't in the existing literature, was to write down an indirect utility function. So that's the maximised value of utility for a representative individual in the economy. Within this economy, there's a whole lot of individuals. Every individual owns certain amounts of factors of production. And that value of indirect utility, which you can get out of the model, indicates the utility representing individual loans factors of production in proportion to the economy's endowment of the factors of production, and where some of the factor of production is unemployed, then each individual's unemployment factor is proportional to the overall unemployment of that factor. That kind of gives you a benchmark level of utility. But as William's presentation, I think, very nicely illustrated this morning, there's in any trade policy change, whether it be something in the economy changing or some sort of policy like a tariff or a tariff cut, there are distributional issues. And so you can actually play with this to think about the distributional issues. Think about a representative labour owner, skilled labour owner, or a representative unskilled labour owner. And actually bring within the model, bring within the analysis, rigorous handle that sort of distributional analysis that we discussed in relation to the model behind the Freedom Report. You can go through and I'm not going to explain the picture, and you can derive comparative static results. So you can change one of the exogenous variables. Here, you put changing the endowment of factor 1. Seeing what the effect on factor prices and non-traded good prices and outputs, etc., is. You can go through and have a look at, analyse the changes in different variables. You've got increases in endowments. You can transfer to income, which is a proxy for foreign borrowing, and analyse the effects of that. That was Ronald Wilson's problem in his 1930 book. And you can actually do it in a in a model like this. We can talk about how labour market changes, increasing minimum wage or reducing minimum wage, might influence trade and income distribution in our economy. We can think about how terms of trade movements might impact the distribution of income, output and employment, this sort of thing. I thought Max was going to be talking about his model, which has had quite a bit of play recently. It's a Melbourne Institute for Economic and Social Research paper, called the Three-Speed Economy, available on our website easily. So Max's model, which is purely verbal, is analysing the impact of great improvement in Australian terms of trade on an economy a little bit like it seems. Model is not that it has a few differences to this, but it's a model in this general family. So now, having given you a little bit of a sense of what a model like this, a small open economy model actually looks like, and how you might build it, how you play with it, what you can get out of it. What do we do with the results? And I remember writing that paper some years ago and confidently imagining that by messing around with the comparative static properties of the model, one could come up with policy recommendations. And I now feel acutely embarrassed about my extreme naivety in doing that. I still think that this sort of modelling can be enormously useful in thinking about the connections within the economy, but the policy process is just a hell of a lot more complicated than that. One of my favourite international economists is Jacob O'Brien, and I think his wisdom is vastly greater than mine. I certainly rely on was a newly minted trade theorist playing around with these sort of models. But let me just conclude by saying that I think both history and trade modelling are opportunities for some of you in the audience. There's great scope for work being done on the history of Australian trade theory. There's also great opportunities in Australia for those of you perhaps who are more analytically inclined to really make a name, to make a contribution, more importantly, to policy debates by developing your expertise in international trade, grappling with some of the big problems that we face in Australia at the moment. A lot of which are international issues and amenable to analysis, not necessarily this model, but to other tools within the international trade theorists basket. So I might stop there and happy to take questions, comments, etc. Or Andrew.